The LDK Game is an OpenDingux based emulation handheld that was originally released in early 2019. Generally found for under $60 online, this little gadget includes a number of features that might make it appealing for retro gaming fans who are searching for a pocketable device to play games on the go. Does the LDK truly live up to expectations, or is there more here than meets the eye? Let's find out. The LDK Game comes bundled with stock firmware that provides a lot of functionality out of the box. Nicknamed the useless firmware by the dev community, this version of the firmware is actually built on a deprecated Lynx library system, and is thus not supported moving forward by the development team. Instead, to get the true experience of the LDK, you're going to need to flash the internal SD card with an image file for the retro firmware, or retrofw as I'll be referring to it in the rest of this video. I'm not going to go too in-depth here, but I would recommend that you use the program Balena Etcher to write retrofw to the internal SD card, and then make use of something like the Mini-Tool Partition Wizard to expand the partition to fit the full storage of the SD card. That way, you'll basically just nuke the old image and then replace it with the new one in a quick and easy process, so be sure to try out those steps if you're having issues with any other methods. The LDK is actually based on the chipset of a previous open source handheld, that being the RS-97, which has a wider form factor, more reminiscent of the Game Boy Advance or PlayStation Portable. A lot of information on the web about the RS-97 will also apply to the LDK, so keep that in mind if you're going to be doing more research after this video. Of course, it's difficult to talk about this device without also bringing up the new BittBoy, a similar low-priced mini handheld which has now gone on to release a version 3 revision of the hardware since my review of the version 2 hardware a month ago. This new version now including a tempered glass screen, rumble support, and fixed ghost key issues. As far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, but the screen tearing issues that I discussed in that video should still apply to this new batch, so I will be basing my comparisons in this video with all of these facts in mind. Anyway, with all of this preamble finally out of the way, let's dig into the meat of this. If you happen to be familiar with the useless firmware, that stock firmware that I mentioned earlier, you might notice upon booting retrofw that a number of ports and systems from that version are missing, at least as of the making of this video. In my opinion, what's missing here is not really going to make or break your ability to enjoy the device, and I'd expect that a lot of these will eventually get ported back over to retrofw maybe in the coming months. So overall, I really wouldn't worry too much about it. What you do get here in retrofw is a vast array of capable emulators that the new BittBoy custom firmware can barely hold a candle to. I welcome with open arms the addition of CPS 1 and 2 arcade systems, ScummVM, Neo Geo Pocket, Atari Lynx, all these numerous retro computer systems, as well as more stable deployments of PlayStation, Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, and DOSBox. They even included a Pokemon Mini emulator on here, like this is already approaching PSP levels of variety. This retrofw is built on the back of G-Menu NX, a fork of the same menu system that's used in the BittBoy custom firmware and many other devices of this ilk. You can customize the skin as well as the shortcuts and sections just like on the BittBoy custom firmware, but the LDK menu on retrofw comes with some nice additions in comparison, including some expanded features in the settings menu that we'll discuss a little more in a bit. Another distinct benefit that LDK has in comparison to the new BittBoy is the general build quality. Not only do you get clicky, responsive L and R buttons, but the directional pad also feels silky smooth in comparison to the grindy, squeaky D-pad of the BittBoy. I have the new edition of the yellow skin, the older one being early on in production at least from what I've heard, with a lighter hue to the color and lower quality plastic. You can also get this device in a clear, see-through case if you fancy. The button layout is reminiscent of a Super Nintendo controller, though the colors aren't quite laid out as you would expect. I'm guessing probably to avoid copyright issues. I'll most likely be popping mine out and swapping them around after this review. I will say that while it's nice that the LDK does have shoulder buttons, they can start to strain your hands a little bit after longer play sessions, at least if you have short, stubby fingers like mine. Generally speaking, I think the controls layout needs a little bit of work if they're going to put out a version 2 of this handheld in the future. You'll notice this issue in some games more than others, I think, but overall, I would say that this handheld isn't the most ergonomic experience. Some more benefits of the LDK's physical form factor include function buttons for brightness and sleep mode in the menu on the left side, as well as a decent power switch and physical volume wheel on the right. Sleep mode is an okay feature to have on this device, but the default screen timeout on idle is incredibly low for some reason, so I'd probably bump that up as high as possible in the settings. As opposed to the awkward volume and brightness handling of the BittBoy, all of the physical components on the LDK feel pretty good, though I do have a couple nitpicks. The volume wheel does not actually mute the device completely at its lowest setting, leaving a slight but noticeable amount of sound still playing out of the speaker. Luckily, if this is too bothersome, it is possible to mute the device through the settings menu, but of course this is still an annoyance for people who are more used to a normal Game Boy, for example. Also, I don't know if this is just an issue with my unit itself, but every once in a while the power switch won't correctly trigger on the power when I flip it on. It can be kinda difficult to replicate this behavior, but unfortunately there are some instances where I'll have to flip it on a second or third time before it finally powers on correctly. Again, this is a really minor nitpick, but these are the kinds of considerations that should be discussed, especially when reviewing a budget device. The LDK supports direct USB mode through the charging port, allowing you to access both the internal and external SD storage when plugged into a PC. Since the device supports external SD, that's likely where you're going to want to be loading up your games, as the internal SD is only 16 GB and already has some space taken up by the firmware data. I'll include the directory here where to find your external SD in the LDK's file system, because I had some issues finding this folder at first when I was trying to load up my games. Once you open up a game for the first time through an emulator, the device will remember your path to the games of that system automatically, as opposed to having to set it manually on the BittBoy. As such, it would be smart to keep your games in separate folders per system as to not lead to further confusion down the line. Just like with the BittBoy, you can tweak the CPU clock speed per emulator, but the LDK also gives you the option to tweak the CPU clock speed device-wide in the CPU settings menu, as well as tweaking the upper and lower thresholds of the CPU clock. It is possible to overclock the LDK past 700 MHz, but I wouldn't advise long-term use of this, as it could shorten the lifespan of your device. I can't confirm this, but I have seen some discussion online that certain units will not support an overclock over 700 MHz, so if you try overclocking this high and you run into constant crashes, I would recommend turning it down near the mid-600s at maximum. The crashes themselves aren't harmful necessarily, but they are still a sign that the device can't handle what you're throwing at it. Overclocking can provide a slight performance bump in systems like PlayStation, SNES, and DOSBox. If you aren't satisfied with the performance at stock clock in certain games and have already tried frame skip and the like, it is worth testing this out to see how much performance you can squeeze out of the CPU. Just keep in mind the potential risks if you choose to do this. Once you get your games up and running, you'll notice how nice and smooth everything looks on screen, especially if you're like me and have been playing on a BittBoy for the past couple of months. The device supports full 60 frames per second speed and has no screen tearing issues, something the BittBoy unfortunately has not been able to lay claim to. In a lot of emulators, the button used for sleep mode in the menu will instead trigger the emulator menu, which is a nice touch, though certain other emulators will make use of some variation of start and select. As far as the games go, well, in a lot of cases there really isn't much to say, it just works. Pretty much any 8-bit game that you're going to want to throw at this thing will work flawlessly thanks to some well-refined emulator programs. As implied before, the upper limits of console and handheld emulation on this device seem to be Super Nintendo, PlayStation, and Game Boy Advance, as well as like early 90s 2D DOSBox. Various other less popular systems may have more volatile performance, but they're generally at least at an acceptable level with the potential to be improved in the future with updates. Some specific things to note about the emulators include considerations for arcade games, where on the BittBoy we'd be using MAME for All. In this case, your best option appears to be the FBA or Final Burn Alpha emulator for CPS 1, 2, Neo Geo, and really any other vintage arcade stuff that you're going to want to throw at it. Just be sure not to press L and R simultaneously when you're playing a game, as the emulator seems to have some odd functions bound to this combination for some reason, including, like, completely pausing the game. MAME for All is still present here, but does not seem to work very well, at least in my testing. For any pre-Genesis Sega games, such as Master System or Game Gear, I would definitely recommend using SMS Plus over Pico Drive, as Pico Drive tends to have some odd flashing on startup for some of these games, and Game Gear games in particular have completely garbled colors when using Pico Drive. If you want to try Sega CD games, make sure you put the corresponding BIOS files in the .pico drive folder of the internal storage. For Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, you'll have the choice between Oh Boy and Gambat, just like on the BittBoy, which both support custom palettes for original Game Boy games, a lovely feature that can provide a refreshing new way to play some of those charming older titles. The GBA emulator ReGBA is excellent, with higher compatibility in comparison to GPSP on the BittBoy, and even supporting Fast Forward, a nice little emulator feature that can make some slow-paced RPGs quite a bit more tolerable. I mentioned ScummVM support earlier on in the video, an interesting piece of software that was not present on the BittBoy. This emulator supports a variety of old PC point-and-click games, and while stuff like Day of the Tentacle here works pretty good, other newer stuff like the Humongous games have some visual glitches that really need to be ironed out. For 16-bit consoles, you're going to do pretty well with the aforementioned Genesis and Sega CD, as well as PC Engine and PC Engine CD stuff, BIOS file included for that last one, of course. SNES sees a considerable improvement over its deployment on the new BittBoy, taking into account support for 6 buttons out of the box on the LDK, as well as improved performance of the emulator. You're still going to struggle with high-end stuff like Star Fox here that makes use of the special Super FX chip, but a considerable chunk of Nintendo's 16-bit library is totally playable in all of its glory on the LDK. PlayStation is the technical tour de force on this system, and while not perfect, you can still see some excellent performance in spots with a number of tweaks, including overclocking. In general, two-dimensional games and earlier parts of the library will have better performance, but the best way to see if a specific game will work or not is just to test. Overall, I'd say that you can get a pretty good PS1 experience on the LDK, especially in games like Twisted Metal 2, where custom control schemes within the game can help to make it more playable with just the face buttons and the D-pad. Despite some of the minor issues with the LDK, I'm happy to report that there really are no glaring technical drawbacks to keeping the average person from enjoying this device once it's been completely set up, unlike the new BittBoy line of devices. I did struggle a little bit more getting this thing up and running compared to the BittBoy, but now that I've gotten it fully configured with retrofw, it's quickly becoming my favorite device to carry with me on the go. Man, like, I was a PSP diehard for many years, but this device is quickly convincing me to rethink my ways, with the power it packs in such a small case. I only paid about $15 more for the LDK than I did the new BittBoy version 2, and that was money well spent, because this device truly is the king of mini-clone handhelds in mid-2019. It may not be perfect, and heck, if you're willing to fork out more cash, I'd argue that there are many superior options on the market. But if you're just looking for a nice gift, or maybe your first venture into handheld gaming and you don't want to break the bank, I can't find too many reasons to recommend against the LDK. Hey, thanks for watching this review of the LDK Game handheld using the retrofw custom firmware. Since you made it this far, here's some footage of my neighbor Amish Crusader's cute little dog named Coco. He helped me do all the camera work needed for this video as well as the BittBoy review. Hey, thanks again man, I really appreciate it. Also wanted to give a quick shout out to Jutleys for his work promoting the LDK and BittBoy, as well as hosting an excellent website with tons and tons of information about these handhelds. Definitely go check out that link in the description. Also, quick shoutouts to all the developers on these projects, including Steward, Triforce, Game Blah Blah, and anybody else that I may have missed. You guys are what make all of this possible. If you want to get a hold of any of these people, as well as the clone handheld community at large, I definitely recommend checking out the Retro Game Handhelds Discord, which I will also be sure to link below. Alright, that's all I got. Thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you all next time.